Welcome back, everybody, to this live stream, a long-standing, in-the-making moment here between myself and two good friends, colleagues, peers on YouTube. My name is Pyotr. I'm the host of the Global Gambit. You may know me from various podcasts or other things, and I'm joined by my fellow liberal, Professor James Ker Lindsay of the James Ker Lindsay YouTube channel, and Professor Michael Rossi of the Michael Rossi channel, I suppose, or poli-sci, I think is what you say on your title, isn't it, Michael? We have a nickname for this collaboration, which is Two Liberals and a Marxist. It's not really, I think, how we perceive things, but it was once said by someone in the comments and it kind of stuck. And I do promise those of you interested that merchandise is on the way. I'm just rather busy trying to cover the end of the world, be that in Iran, or as we're covering probably the most positive news of this of the year so far, gentlemen, is Hungary. That's the topic of today: is Hungary, Europe, NATO, Ukraine, and what looks like a good win for democracy. A good demonstration that democracy is resilient, it is alive, and if anything, I think just to lay the foundations for our conversation, I think I was relatively reassured that Orban didn't fight it more. It was a very civil sort of, gave them a call, it conceded defeat, and here we are. So I don't know who of you would like to jump in first, but it's great to be back with you both.
Yeah, well, it's good to see all of you. Happy Easter, both Easters, Western and Eastern Easter, you know. But I think I'll give James the opening salvo.
Oh gosh! All right. Oh, thank you. And yeah, no. For me, it's been a bit of a prolonged absence. For anyone, I sort of posted a couple of messages. I've been offline for about a month now. Just for the very mundane reason of moving house. It was a huge project to build a house rather than just simply buy one. So we've got to the end of it. But as with these things, you tend to find that not everything matches up. So I've still not got a proper internet connection, working off a 5G mobile. But I've been busy sort of slowly building out my studio. Not quite there, and almost had a mishap this evening with a microphone cable that I was just mentioning to Pyotr. But anyway, hopefully getting back into the swing of things now. And what an eventful 6 weeks it has obviously been. And but Pyotr, as you said, I think of all the chaos that we've been seeing over Iran. This has actually been the news from Hungary from last night is really truly one of the positive bits of news that we're seeing at the moment. And I mean, there's so much that I think we can talk about with Orban. I think the first thing I'd probably say is that, I'm already starting to see parts of the net sort of saying, oh, well, this is proof that Orban was democratic. And no, not at all. I think what we saw, his decision to concede, is really the result of the fact that this was such an overwhelming victory that there was just no way that he could have covered this up. And I think had it just been a couple of percentage points, I think he would have contested it, and then we would have been in a world of chaos, because I think a lot of people in Europe would have been very, very suspicious of those results, and rightly so. But Orban would have shown up, and he would have got the whole mechanism of state behind him that he controls to keep him in power. But I think that this was a testament. The fact that the result is that 70%, there was no ballot box stuffing that you could do that was going to make up for that, and there was a lot of scrutiny that was going on. So as I say, anyone who would say that this is the proof that democracy can win, it's a proof that democracy can win, but only in those cases where it's just so utterly overwhelming that really it can't be contested. So I think, as I say, it's a great result. There's no doubt about it. And I think we'll delve into it. But the extent to which Orban had completely and utterly taken control of the Hungarian state just sort of shows just what overwhelming opposition there is and there was to his rule by the end of it.
Well, I'm just sharing on screen the preliminary election results. So you need 133 for a two-thirds majority in the Hungarian parliament of 199 seats. We're on 138. But what I also think is important is the turnout. Nearly 80%. That's a high turnout for any election. And but on the other flip side, I would also emphasize that Peter is not, and I'm not talking about myself here, Peter Magyar's political orientation is not drastically different. It's not like we've shifted to sort of the Social Democrats or something. Right. I saw on X earlier a summary of some of his policies, and these are essentially, he's not going to use Hungary's veto in the case of funding for Ukraine, but he doesn't think Ukraine should be fast-tracked into the EU, which I agree with. And he's still fiscally conservative, right? He's still more right-wing on the political spectrum. He's just more willing to adhere to the European Union's mechanisms and things like that. So, and the other thing that I think is worth noting is that, of course, in any political system, I had a very interesting conversation with someone from The Economist earlier. Actually, we're beginning a collaboration with them on a recurring basis now, which is exciting for the show. But it was about the democracy index. And of any country I can think of, Hungary is a unique example of an illiberal democracy, right? It has elections, it has mechanisms, the judiciary, all these things, but they're not necessarily respected. And Orban has always been the pin-up strongman or wannabe strongman, politicizing the judiciary, centralization of power, intimidating political opposition. So my point is, and Michael, I'll pass it to you, is simply, just because we now have a new government doesn't mean that the remnants of Orban are gone. He's still going to be firmly in the system, right? It's like the Supreme Court in the United States. Trump has made that very conservative,
right?
So it's not like Hungary's out of the woods yet.
Well, the way that I see this is Orban's defeat was not surprising for a number of reasons. First of all, Orban and Fidesz has been in control of Hungary for the last 16 years. So a lot of analysis are going to be looking at all of this and saying this is a referendum on Hungary's shift to the east, their EU skepticism, and that Magyar, you couldn't ask for a better name, Péter Magyar, for somebody, to be contesting Orban. I am, with all due respect to James, a little bit more skeptical about the long-term future of Hungary, simply because this is Central European politics, which tends
Michael, I just have to jump in. Don't mistake the fact that I said that Orban had been defeated. That meant that I think we're in the clear. I think, as we'll discuss, I harbour deep reservations about Magyar as well. Then I think we need to discuss that. But I think as a first comment.
Okay, so in that regard,
that Orban had been defeated.
In that regard, as true to form, I tend to agree more with James long term than I do short term. And I only say this because I am looking at Hungary and I'm wondering if many people are seeing this in the same way a couple of years ago as when the presidential elections had taken place in Slovakia between Zuzana Čaputová and Robert Fico's designate. I can't remember what
Fico's puppet.
I can't remember his name. He was just basically Fico's puppet, and Čaputová won overwhelmingly. There's no question about that. And yet, at the same time, as has already been mentioned, TISA is another right-of-center, conservative, populist party like Fidesz, except the only thing that is different is that TISA is pro-EU, while Fidesz was more Eurosceptic. That was basically it. So when it comes to Central European politics, please, please, please do not, everyone who is listening, mistake this as some kind of referendum on illiberal national populism, illiberal democracy, that Hungary is now suddenly, reconnecting within the mainstream center, left of center, sentiment of the European Union. In many respects, the way that I see this is that it's not a surprising outcome. Orban and Fidesz has been in control of Hungary for the last 16 years. And while many people can say that, yes, Orban has effectively achieved state capture of the state, has turned the country into the one, EU skeptic about Ukraine and about further EU integration. Many people can say that he was pro-Putin in that regard. I think that at the end of the day, Orban, his days were numbered just very simply because he's been in power for 16 years. And, regardless of whether Trump or Vance or the MAGA, Republicans of the United States had endorsed Orban, many people in Hungary were, rightfully skeptical and ready for a change. Now, as was already pointed out, TISA is another right-wing populist government. The only difference is that they tend to be more pro-EU than pro-Russia. So I'm looking at, what I examined a couple of years ago in Slovakia when Fico's government was first defeated, first at the presidential election between his era, between his designate and Zuzana Chapatova, which was largely seen as a symbolic vote against entrenched corruption. But when the parliamentary elections in Slovakia took place a year later, Progressive Slovakia, the very party that represents Chapatova, lost extraordinarily. This is not a one-to-one comparison, right? I'm not saying that this is the same thing, but I'm just simply saying give this a sense of caution and guarded optimism, because if anything, the referendum in this election against Orban is not so much Hungarians choosing Europe over Russia or multiculturalism over nativism. It's just simply the idea that Orban has done much in Hungarian politics to cement himself and his party as a single party mafia state riddled with corruption. So the election may very well be that. And I believe that at the end of this conversation, James and I are once again going to come to the same conclusion, just from different rationales, right?
That so am I simply the bridge between you two?
I don't know. What do you got to say? What's your hot take, Pyotr?
Opposition. So I'm always just sort of forgotten about, or it's just like, I never disagree with Pyotr. Pyotr's points are always perfection. No, I'm obviously being facetious, but no, I mean, look, I just... From my understanding, Magyar ran on a platform of bringing everyone together, trying to appeal to people based on resetting the political system, disenfranchised, disillusioned Fidesz voters, as well as the centre-left or the moderate area. He wants to roll back part of Orban's centralized system. He wants to restore that judicial independence, investigate the corruption, the cronyism. What I find interesting is he's already in one of the speeches he first gave, he made a clear distinction between the Russian government and the Russian people. Now, I know some people watching will argue, well, the government is a reflection of people's choices and behavior and so on, which I think is true to an extent. But I would also argue that the government has influenced the minds and thinking of the Russian people over time. It's a complicated one. The point is, he's not pro-Russia, he's not pro-Putin, that's for sure. But he's not also trying to demonize Russia in the same way. I think one of the policies he has suggested is that Hungary will continue to import Russian energy, but they're going to unlock that 20 billion in frozen EU funds, and they're going to rebuild cooperation with Brussels, strengthen the alignment with NATO, which is obviously a huge win for the European Union. Overnight, it has opened the EU from being a relatively politically paralyzed supranational body to now a vehicle, an entity that can make decisions and possibly, be a proper counterweight against the United States, against China, Russia, etc., etc. But I'm sure we'll get into more of that over the next hour and a bit. So, yeah, I'm very positive about it, but I also think it's important to look at those micro differences because they obviously determine the strategic outlook of Hungary and therefore the EU. What I do think is interesting is if we're going to see a return sort of to the Visegrad, right? Poland's back, more with Donald Tusk again. Now we've got Hungary. The only outlier really now is Robert Fico and Slovakia. as far as I can tell. They seem to be the one who's more Russia orientated or pro-Putin. Serbia is different, but I'm not going to wake that up.
Well, I mean, it gets complicated. And I think Michael hit a really good point, that when we talk about the Visegrad Four, that this has clearly been a positive development, but also, I mean, they've been a really interesting group of countries because they have been perpetual troublemakers in different ways. These are four major Central European states that, between them, look at, we had all sorts of problems with Poland for many, many years. We've had Fico's now back. Little bit more moderate than Orban, or so it seems. There was the assassination attempt, of course, and he seems to have gone rather quiet, certainly on the international stage since then. But he and Orban were very, very close, and even remembering in the Czech Republic that there is also a difference. Tusk is very positive as a prime minister, but there is a much more hardline president, of course, in Poland as well. So it does show that there are these important undercurrents. I think the really interesting thing now with what we're going to see in Hungary, well, I mean, there's so many interesting things, but I think the question with Magyar is, the fact is, look, as we've identified, he does have quite strong views, sort of, I was about to say authoritarian, but certainly populist.
Yeah.
And it will be, he's certainly going to be in a honeymoon phase, but he is a product of Fidesz. And there will be questions about what he is going to do. And I think, we can see a trend in politics in Central Europe over many, many decades of leaders who come in who are great reformers, who are very pro-European, and then start to take the dark path. Orban was very much in that, he was seen as very liberal, pro-European, pro-Western, and then he went. But we can point to other examples. I mean, the other one that I would immediately sort of highlight is someone like Nikola Gruevski, who was, in North Macedonia, for example, who started off as a very moderate figure, pro-EU, and then with time, with power, became increasingly authoritarian. So I think the key thing is to see how that plays out. I mean, we're talking, this is going ahead a few years, but in the meantime, the key thing is how much Europe can win him over and woo him and sort of give him all the goodies that he's going to need to be able to take the message to the Hungarian people. Look, I'm delivering for you. Orban was completely corrupt. And the other thing I'd be really interested to see is what he's going to do internally to shake Hungary up, because as has been noted, that Orban has completely stuffed all state institutions from top to bottom with loyalists, and he is going to have to deal with that. What will be, I think, really especially fascinating is if he will do what we've seen in other places like Croatia, where he brings Orban to trial for corruption. Launches an investigation and says, this is somebody who has robbed the country blind, and sort of then goes after Orban in that way. I mean, not just as, this is not about political retribution. It is absolutely clear that Orban has been corrupt on an unbelievable scale, and what Magyar is going to do to tackle that.
I do want to add one quick point of observation, and also actually cheers, because I am celebrating this. Well, I don't know. There was an open bottle of Prosecco in my girlfriend's fridge, so I thought I'd just have some as an excuse.
You know what? It's Holy Monday after Orthodoxy.
I should say, actually, happy Orthodoxy from the Slavic world. But I will be in New York in the next few days. Some of you watching have been wondering what I've been waiting to share on the channel. Be in New York in the next few days, and one of the exciting things is that means I get to meet Michael in person. Michael can be bothered to meet me, unlike James, who didn't want to when I was in Cyprus last year.
Either way,
you really want me to tell everyone why I couldn't meet you when you came over?
No, I was building a house. No, there was other reasons as well, which are actually very important. No, I thought that was slightly later. Well, anyway.
No, it wasn't. For anyone who doesn't know, my son was preparing to have very major surgery. So,
I didn't know that at the time.
So it wasn't a particularly good time for me.
No, but what I was going to say actually is simply that you mentioned populism as though, James, it can't be, it's always a negative. Because Meloni has shown to be someone who's pretty pragmatic, pro-Ukraine, open to working with NATO. Okay, she's got some questionable policies domestically, although one of them was to push through the first idea of femicide in a bill, which I thought was very powerful for women's rights. So why do you think that populism is inherently a negative? Or you don't? Because I got that sense from you when you mentioned it.
Well, because for the simple reason that it's, politicians who play on populism aren't willing to level with people about the choices that need to be made. And I mean, effectively, I come from an economics and politics background. So the economics tells me that we have finite resources. We have to work out how those resources are going to be spent, how they're going to be used. Choices are going to have to be made. And politics is the process by which you make those decisions. And populism naturally avoids making those tough decisions. It plays to the base instincts of populations and says, we can give you everything. We can give you everything that you want, and doesn't actually level with people. And it leads also, I think, to base instincts in various other ways that we see. I think we live in a very dangerous era with social media that has given an outlet for people to express very unpleasant views. And I think populists have captured onto that, and being populist, wanting to play to those base instincts, are sort of like pressing ahead with a lot of things which I think are very unpleasant, but also don't show a proper appreciation for the difficult choices that societies have to make. That's just the reality of it. And you see it in the UK with reform, populist, completely chaotic in its policies, because it's just simply promising as much as it can to as many people as it can, knowing that it can't possibly deliver on it. And every time that it has had to even deliver on it on a local basis, it's just absolutely chaotic, and we can see it. I would also say the other thing that I would say is that very often a lot of these sort of, especially sort of extreme right populists, are essentially misanthropic. And the thing about misanthropes is that they don't like other people. They might prefer fellow misanthropes over everyone else for a time, but eventually they all fall out with each other. So it doesn't tend to form a particularly good form of governance because they hate each other. So that, in a nutshell, is why I'm not particularly pleased and happy and respectful of populists.
Well, this is what I raised with Catherine Stewart of The Economist earlier, because obviously as part of any democratic indicator, like the democracy index from The Economist, populism is a driver of that. And one of the things that I find really notable is that in the past, you could argue in the past 10, 15 years, especially since the financial crisis of 2008, there has been a general anti-establishment rhetoric, as there has been anti-globalization. That was what led to Brexit, Trump. But what I find interesting is that Trump is such a unique version of populism, right? To an extent that now, and this is where I'm leading with this, is that Trump is taking a flamethrower to everything, to such a point that you've even got some what we would consider also populists, like Farage and Le Pen, and Meloni, thinking we need to deepen European integration and cooperation to protect ourselves from the United States. There was an FT article about this a couple of months ago. Trump is literally single-handedly pushing people you would always think were Eurosceptics to further think about the importance of the EU, which I find insane. So, are we seeing a divergence in the different types of populism, so to speak? Or that's not something that you think is possible?
Well, I think Meloni is quite clearly a bit of an outlier in all this for all sorts of reasons. And I think she's been sort of in Italy, yes, but certainly on the international stage has been, I think, very impressive and sort of managed to win over a lot of European leaders. But I'm not sure that she is representative of populism across the continent. I think Orban was far more representative and far more at the center of a web of populist activity across Europe. That has come out very, very clearly, that he was spending fortunes funding populist parties elsewhere and pushing a very, very unpleasant pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian form of populism that Meloni isn't. Meloni is sort of saying, look, I've got some policies which people would call populist and things. But on the other hand, as you point out quite rightly, she has also been at the vanguard of trying to promote a European approach to problems and has been pro-Ukraine and sort of recognizing the need for Europeans to work together. And I think, don't get me wrong, as a liberal and a centrist, I believe fundamentally in democracy and the fact that we need to have democratic debate, because, as I said, coming from an economics background, you make those choices. You need to have proper debates about how to make those choices. So I believe that there is space for centre-left, centre-right, centrist parties. It's on the extremes that you run into problem, and populists are promising rather unpleasant policies and also things that just can't be paid for. So, yeah. So don't, as I say, I think Maloney is more an example of somebody on the political right, further on the political right, but certainly seems to be someone who, other European leaders can recognize as essentially one of them, even though she sort of extends more on the right-wing fringe.
I want to add another point, but Michael hasn't said much for a while, so I'll hold it off.
Sorry, I'll back off on that.
No, it's...
Well, I mean, what we need to understand about populism as a political theory is that essentially, historically, theoretically, originally, populism is more of a left-wing phenomenon than a right-wing. Historically speaking, populism started out in both Europe and the United States. Very different reasons, but it needs to be said. Because we talk about American populism, we also talk about European populism, someone like Meloni versus Trump. The important thing to understand is that populism began in the late 19th century as more of an agrarian, left-wing, pro-labor movement that is based on the dichotomy between us and them. The original populism was all about farmers versus industrialists, towns versus cities, Main Street versus Wall Street. Populism, in its essential element, is a reactionary element within democracy that seeks to dichotomize between the rich and the poor, the people who have all the wealth and those who don't. So in that regard, populism can be both left-wing and right-wing. Historically speaking, populism in the late 19th and early 20th century was the closest thing that America ever had towards Marxism. It was working class versus industrial class. The type of populism that we're talking about in terms of Hungary, and more importantly, Central Europe, the Visegrad Four, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, all transitioned to democracy in the late 80s, early 90s, along very unique lines that, in my opinion, blended nationalism and ethnic exclusionarianism along with pro-European democracy. So this explains the type of populism that exists within Central Europe that can be pro-Western, pro-EU, anti-Soviet, anti-communism, but also very much anti-migrant, anti-immigrant, and anti-multiculturalism. So we have to be very, very clear on this. People like Orban and Tusk and most of the populists within Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, even Hungary, are not agrarian populists in the historical sense, but national populists. Orban is a national populist. Fico is a national populist. Whether it is right-wing Polish politics or left-wing liberal Polish, they are still very much a type of national populism that favors what I regard as the 4 Fs: faith, family, flag, and fatherland over everything else. So we have to be very careful in thinking that Orban's defeat is a defeat of populism. It is not. It is simply getting rid of one corrupt individual, as James very rightly points out. He's been in power for 16 years. It was a matter of time before Fidesz was voted out. No question about that. Many people are going to regard Orban's electoral defeat as somehow indicative of him being pro-Russian, anti-EU. Vance goes there and speaks on his behalf. Trump speaks on his behalf. It didn't help. It did not help. I'm not going to lie. It did not help. Vance is fantastic as going to a country, saying what he wants to say, and everybody is like, okay, you know what? Fuck that. I'm voting for the other thing. But regardless of that, okay, you know, Orban's days were eventually going to be numbered. But that's the reason why I said in the beginning of this conversation, take a look at Slovakia, because Central European politics is not about populism versus anti-populism. It is all about entrenched corrupt populism versus anti-corrupt mass movement populism. It's two sides of the same coin.
So which transmogrifies into corrupt long-term.
And that's my whole point. Look, I just want to, point out, a couple of years ago, Zuzana Chapotova won the presidential election against Fico's, sponsor. I forget what his name was. Fico was so ridiculously unpopular. He was toxic at the time because he was connected. His government, Smer, was connected with the murder of Jan Kuciak, who was a young journalist who was trying to investigate the connection between Fico and organized crime. When when he and his girlfriend were murdered, there were mass protests across Slovakia, which were basically translated into an anti-Fico, anti-Smer election. Chapotova won as the president of Slovakia. It is primarily a ceremonial role. So when I had written articles back then, I had cautioned people to say, don't take this as a way of saying that Slovakia is, returning to the Euro neoliberal fold. When parliamentary elections took place in Slovakia 1 year later, Progressive Slovakia, the party that Chapotova represented, was defeated decisively. Who won? Some kind of catch-all elite-based individual named Igor Matovic, who ran this party called Oljano, which is this non-political, non-establishment political party. He didn't even, live out his mandate for 4 years, 5 years. I'm not saying that, Hungary is the same as Slovakia. I'm simply saying be very careful and just engage with political analysis for Central Europe with guarded optimism. Because Orban had lost, but he had run the country for 16 years. If Magyar is little more than Orban Part 2, then I wouldn't get all that excited.
I don't think he is. He's not echoing the same talking points or narrative lines, Michael. I think he's quite different. Am I going to jump and say, he's, the Popular Front of France? No. But, this is what can happen when you have exogenous factors or shock events like Iran. And what I mean by that is look at Sanchez, look at Spain, right? Mm-hmm. What was his ratings, popularity, before Trump's unilateral move over Iran? They were pretty poor. And now the guy has had a second wind because everyone is like, this guy is amazing for standing up to Trump, for standing up to the Israeli Zionist movement, or people. That's the framing that is being made about Spain and stuff. Obviously, I think we'll come to NATO specifically a bit later, but it's a remarkable thing for Spain to say no to the United States. And therefore, for Trump to say, with the Chancellor of Germany sitting next to him, mind you, say, oh, well, we could just go in and take the bases. Who's going to stop us? He's literally kind of, insinuating in a sort of declaration of war or an act of war on a NATO ally. My point is, more broadly, is that we're in for a pretty interesting time now that there seems to be the biggest obstacle to the European Union being removed, and that can unleash a lot more potential in decision making in Brussels to stand up to Trump, to push back against it in not just an economic sense but militarily potentially, and I'm interested where he's going to sit in this overall orientation. Like, I'm sure he's limited in how much he wants NATO support to support Ukraine or or funding, but equally he's quite clearly, he's like a Meloni. I'm sort of seeing similarities between the new head of Hungary and Meloni. But what I'm interested, what I also wanted to throw into the mix, it sort of goes back to what you were saying, James, which is the populists tend to make a lot of promises, which are then not followed through on, or they're completely ridiculous. You can never actually achieve them. My problem with the centrism element right now, at least in the UK, is that Starmer has made a lot of promises, or he ran on a platform of like, the geopolitical, economic realities of England are pretty poor right now. They're pretty depressing. And, this has been covered in the mainstream media in the UK relentlessly, which simply the messaging has been cynical, sad, realistic. But people are like, okay, can we actually have some hope now? There's a bit of a pushback against Starmer because he's been so like, well, and now just today he said the UK is going to look at rejoining the EU single market or improve the relations. But also, and where I'm going with all of this massive interjection is simply, we're living in a time where the fringes seem to be the defining elements. The center ground is being eroded in parts of Europe, but not in others. And yet we've got a united front seemingly emerging in Europe as a whole. In the UK, the Greens and Reform are leading the way. The Conservatives, the Labour Party are being undermined. Macron, obviously, in France next year is incredibly important. Germany's not doing all too well. The AfD is looking pretty strong there. So when we take into factor the sort of thawing out, if you like, of the centre ground towards the fringes, the political polarization, people are voting together, but the political polarization is still there. It's a bit of a weird blend, is it not? There's a question in there somewhere, or a point. I don't know if you understand what I mean, James.
Mm-hmm. No, I do. I understand exactly what you mean. And I think, Starmer and what we've seen in the UK has been a really fascinating case, because this is somebody who has been far too cautious because people recognize that he didn't want to upset a core, or what he felt was a core Labour vote, by going against the populist message of reform. So, we have seen that there is a very hard line.
I can clarify my question because it was something I asked Catherine earlier, which is simply, we are seeing stronger democracies, or democracy seems resilient based on Hungary as a result, right? It's a positive. But within those democracies, the political polarization seems stronger.
Yeah, but that was exactly the point I was making. I think the problem with Starmer is that he didn't want to take on reform, and he put in place a very hardline Home Secretary who is imposing all sorts of, really pretty horrible and nasty policies in order to win over the reform. So you can see that. And yet, the tangible step that would deliver economic growth for the UK is closer relations with the European Union. And Starmer avoided that, but now I think has realized late in the day, partly, there's all sorts of theories of this, not, for those who get down in the mud on British politics. He had a chief of staff called Morgan McSweeney, who was following, I think, what many of us felt was a ridiculous policy. But once he's gone, and I think other trends within the Labour Party are starting to recognise that you can't chase those votes that Reform are after. They've gone to Reform following those nasty, complete anti-immigration policies and stuff. And these are policies that just aren't, not based on any common sense at all. But Starmer is now recognizing that if you want economic growth and you want to be able to deliver to people the services that they want, better health services, you've got to start with the economy. And there is, Brexit has done enormous damage to the British economy. So it's not about just saying, we're going to go against the immigrants and that's going to make everything fine and good in the UK, because it isn't going to make everything fine and good again. What is going to make things fine and good, or start that process, is re-engaging in the single market, opening up British exports, closer relations. And I think that, this is where you run into this problem of populism versus sensible politics, and leveling with people and painting a picture for them that if you aren't willing to take on the populists who will say anything, then you're not going to, you can't beat them by trying to play their game, because as everyone always says, people will want the authentic populism, not the inauthentic one. Nobody believes Starmer is really a populist at heart, even if he has got an extremely hardline Home Secretary. So I think you're right in the sense that this is a problem that we're having to deal with in democracies, but maybe now we are starting to see some level of realism sort of emerge, and a willingness by politicians to speak truth to people and level with people. And maybe that's what people also want. But I come back to the point that we've already raised again. I think when we talk about Central European politics, and I don't say this out of some sort of, that this is a completely alien area to me. For anyone who knows me and knows, my academic background, I've spent my entire career actually looking at Southeast European politics. So my area, if you like, of specialization stops at the border with Hungary, but it doesn't mean I'm not familiar with it. And I'm very familiar with politics in sort of the Western Balkan region, and we see a lot of these trends that elsewhere. And so we've got to take with a grain of salt what we're hearing certainly in many media outlets about Magyar. And I think as Michael and I both pointed out that I don't wish to be the very negative about this, and I am hopeful that at least in the short term, that Europe will go on a blitz with Magyar, try and win him over, fate him, that money will open up to him, he'll be treated as a hero when he turns up in Brussels, and maybe that will do some good and sort of keep him on the path for now. But looking ahead, I think we've seen far too many cases of people who've managed to sort of, as Michael had again mentioned, state capture, but maybe that's a story for another day. But we should just be pleased at the moment that Orban's out. But
no, it's relative,
worried that looking ahead that things might not be quite as rosy. But if at least in the meantime it can mean that money is opened up for Ukraine, that Hungary is not going to be that difficult partner, and the money stops flowing towards all these populist right, extreme right, not just right, far right, extreme right organizations in Europe. The other little thing that I really do hope is that I hope doesn't forget what Trump did to him. That is as well, that Trump sent Vance over to campaign for Orban and things, and maybe Magyar will also recognize that his best interests lie with working with European partners, and revenge is a dish best served cold, as they say. That he'll work, and so Trump's lost Orban, which is a major loss, but it'd be so much sweeter if Magyar sort of finds a way of working with European partners to cement that.
Well, I was going to say, I think Vance should help campaign on behalf of more people more often. It would be great. He has such a great impact on. What is he, 3 for 3 now, I think? Just to reiterate what I said to James when you were away from Michael, simply what I was trying to get at is democracy seems to be strengthened, or this is a positive moment for democracy and its resilience as a system. But what's happening within the democracies is a greater polarization. People seem to be shifting to the fringes in some countries. And that's what I think James was expanding on. So I don't know if you wanted to make any points.
Well, one thing that I think I can absolutely agree on with James is that Central European politics, and again, I have to reiterate, when we talk about Central European, we're talking about Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and by honorary inclusion, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. All of these countries had transitioned from single-party bureaucratic authoritarian rule in the late 80s, early 90s, through a mechanism of ethnocentric nationalism, which is something that many analysts at the time either overlooked or didn't take seriously. So when someone like Orban comes to power in 2010, he's a reformist, he is a market economic integrationist, but he's also a nationalist. And this explains a lot about the politics of Central Europe, because many of these countries, Slovakia, Latvia, and Estonia notwithstanding, with having one substantial minority, all of the others are largely ethnically homogeneous. So their transition to democracy in the late 80s, early 90s took a lot of nationalism, self-determination, anti-communism, anti-Russianism, pro-Europeanism at face value. And so this explains why a lot of these pro-EU, pro-Western parties within Central Europe can also be relatively ethnocentrist, exclusionary, and populist, right? We have to understand that that the Hungarian election this past weekend saw a national populist individual who is widely regarded for state capture and total one-party state control for the past 15 years was defeated by, surprise, surprise, another national conservative. So for people thinking that Hungary is now going to be all of a sudden inclusive and accepting of migrants, hold your breath. If we think that Hungary is all of a sudden going to just write blank checks along with what Brussels says to Ukraine, hold your breath. I may be wrong. I may be a little bit more guardedly optimistic than James is. But my experience with Central European politics, and at the end of the day, James, in my opinion, I love him dearly. I respect him immensely, right? He's dead serious. James tends to be a little bit more positive. I'm a little bit more guardedly pessimistic. I don't know. All I'm trying to say is that I've seen what looks like this happen in Slovakia a couple of years ago, only for Fico to be defeated and for Fico to come back.
Yeah, no. I mean, and in actual fact, Michael, I mean, sorry to interrupt on that, but I think that's really in my mind one of the big questions.
Exactly.
Is we're on the same page. Orban, because he has been a political survivor, and was pointed out that he has stuffed the government from top to bottom. So the question now is, as I said earlier, is what Machel's going to do about it. Exactly. Is he going to start forcing out all the Orban loyalists? How's he going to change the constitution? Or is this going to be a case that he's made all these promises, but once he gets into power and he still thinks, actually, this sort of constitutional change that Orban made isn't quite as bad, is it? It can work in my favor. I just didn't like it when Orban was using it to his advantage, but now can I use it to mine? And I think that this is the real worry. And actually, may I also say that this is one of the things that I also worry about in the United States post-Trump, and Democrats will probably get very upset at this, but I do wonder if there will be a number of changes that have been made by Trump that won't ever be rescinded. Democrats once in power will say, well, actually, it's not a bad thing. And this is where democracies collapse, because,
yes, absolutely.
You see this, and we've seen this in the UK as well. I really expected that Starmer would come in and would have, I have to say that towards the end of the Conservative government, I thought the Labour manifesto was writing itself. Simply all they need to do every day is sort of say, the Conservatives have done this, we will reverse it. I'm not sure how much has been reversed. And some of the big constitutional changes, like abolishing the House of Lords, all right, there have been steps towards it, but, in removing the last hereditaries, but that isn't nearly good enough. That's to introducing a democratic system that gets rid of all the crony appointments.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, and so in this case, I think that James and I are coming at it from, James, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're coming at it from two different approaches, but we're approaching the same point, is that you end up getting somebody in Hungary in the same way that you would hypothetically get somebody in the United States. Let's just say that, in the coming next 3 years, and I need to point out, I have to say this honestly, I really don't know if we can afford another 3 years of Trump, but okay, whatever. If we get someone like Gavin Newsom, you know what he's going to do? He is going to do what every good central liberalist is going to do. Take the national populist rhetoric from the previous administration and just make it more inclusive. Just like Bill Clinton was to Ronald Reagan, what Tony Blair was to Margaret Thatcher, Keir Starmer. I have no faith in Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is absolutely positively going to take the type of national populism plaguing the UK and just make it a more inclusive type of rhetoric from Nigel Farage. So that's why I'm saying whenever there is a major upset in Central Europe, please do not think that this is a reversal. You end up getting somebody that is more pro-EU, but is still very much nativist, very much anti-immigrant, and TISA's the TISA party within the last year went through a national survey about what people wanted within Hungary. And yes, the overwhelming majority is to stay within the EU, to stay within the Euro market. But when the question arose and this is among TISA members, do you support Ukraine's incorporation into the EU and NATO? That support dropped off tremendously. So just as I'm saying, it's Central Europe. Be very careful in terms of your optimism. You may have gotten rid of a political power broker, but you may have just simply replaced it with, at absolute best, a temporary placeholder or another power broker.
But I should say that we are a triumvirate here. What does Crassus have to say on all of this? Pyotr, you've been quiet. How do you see things?
I don't think it's worth thinking about it so far into the future, if I'm honest. I don't think that he can make such statements if he then doesn't want to follow through on them. Mm-hmm. I'm not as pessimistic as you guys might be, or cynical, at least from what I'm understanding.
No, I have to say,
I also, this is where the age element is different. I don't know that much of the history of Hungary, other than obviously the Soviets' actions in the earlier part of the Cold War against Hungary. I've been to Hungary a few times. It was a very complicated country which went through a very difficult 100 years. Mm-hmm. The change of the Austrian-Hungarian, it's the definition of a rump state, right? The rump state being a country that has
don't bring up Trianon.
No, I don't know. I'm not using.
No, I don't mean that. It's sort of like, every Hungarian will be on the comments.
No, what I'm saying is that the country's been through a lot, right? Historically, it's one of the most important in European history, but in modern day European politics, it sits in a very unique place. Personally, for me, it's difficult. I think I don't necessarily think that populism is inherently bad if it's delivered in a way that actually keeps to the promises. Running on a platform that appeals to people is what politicians are all about. Mm-hmm. Personally, my problem with Starmer, if we just use him as an example, he's more of an establishment or something. He's continuing to try to operate, and it kind of goes back to what we talk about in, broader discussions, the joke about how we define this program, but or collaboration, which is simply that Starmer continues to try to operate in a way of the world which just doesn't exist right now. We need to behave in Europe as a collective, I'm talking about, as things are, not as we wish them to be. And you've heard me say that phrase before, but I think it speaks a lot of truth. Starmer is still trying to hold out for sort of, the righteousness of whether or not we should do. Well, I'm sorry, but righteousness is not the defining factor anymore. The quintessential example, when we were talking about it in the comments briefly during your back and forth, is the Chagos deal. I think it's terrible. Does it mean that I don't have any considerations for the rights of the Chagosinian people? I know I'm not pronouncing it correctly. No, of course not. But unfortunately, larger strategic and security concerns, I think, override that. And I don't think that the British Isles should give back the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, partially because the history and the relationship between Mauritius and those islands is quite not sure anyway. So in that regard, I fully support Trump's decision to withdraw support for the deal. Does that mean I'm a pro-Trumpian? No. But I think it depends very much on. This is the other thing. We get so obsessed with the people when we need to look at the policies. And I'm not saying you guys are doing that, but I think that we can.
I don't want to diverge too much on.
You
Hungary, but I just have to address this point on the Chagos Islands, because I think the point that is often missed on all of this is the reason that Britain decided to give them up was because it suffered a resounding defeat in the International Court of Justice, which was then cemented by a resounding defeat within the General Assembly. The International Court of Justice looked at the circumstances surrounding the Chagos Islands, which are now the British Indian Ocean Territory, and decided that Britain had fundamentally broken a core tenet of what had become international law, namely, in colonial territories, you do not split off, you do not break them up, and especially partition them in order to hold one part as a military base. Funnily enough, that resolution that was passed in late 1960 was passed on the back of what had happened here in Cyprus a few months earlier. But nevertheless, it was a court case that actually, what it meant is that every time Britain opened its mouth to tell other countries that they had to respect international law, the Chagos Islands case was being thrown back at them as a very, very clear example of where it had been found in the wrong by the International Court of Justice. There was clear statements from the UN General Assembly condemning Britain's policies, and Britain wasn't following through with it. It was an embarrassment. Something needed to be done about it. And there was a deal that had been worked out. So I'm not nearly as critical. And I think that Trump has no understanding of exactly what happened here. And I think Trump's position is just a reflection of the fact that he doesn't respect international law and is dragging Britain into that position. And Starmer, as an international lawyer of all people, should know that ripping up that deal with the Mauritian government, you know, and I can understand, yes, all right, Mauritius and Chagos Islands, you know, I suppose you could make an argument they're very far away from them, but Britain had created a single territorial unit and then went against UN principles and decolonization when dealing with it. So I think, you know, that's the background to this case as to why I think that Britain has made a huge mistake by ripping up this deal, because it's just left it back in square one. And everyone who says that Britain, every time it opens its mouth to say respect international law, because we're not like Trump, we're not like the Americans, well, no, this gets thrown back. So I really, really think, but I know, look, we should maybe
this is where I disagree with you quite a lot then, James, because I don't think international law has as much prevalence in this regard.
Well, of course it doesn't, if we're doing everything to undermine it the whole time.
But it's hypocrisy of the United Kingdom and the West. And I'm going to sound very uncharacteristic for a second, but this is the problem that a lot of the global South, and the Russians and the Indians, the Chinese, and so many people will jump on immediately and be like, well, you guys don't uphold your own.
Well, and Britain was upholding by recognizing the fact that it needed to do a deal on the Chagos Islands.
But it should never have done it in the first place. Security and strategic issues always supersede human rights matters. We see this time and again. Human rights issues, be them in Kosovo, be them in Rwanda, be them in any historical IHL or IHRL examples, always see that security matters will always dictate nation states' behavior. Can we stop kidding ourselves?
Years.
Yeah, but James, can we stop kidding ourselves?
People had to pay for it.
Yeah, but can we stop?
Had negotiated a deal with the Mauritian government over this, and frankly,
the Mauritian government don't have a decent argument for it either, James. Their framing of it is quite shaky at best.
The International Court of Justice was able to make a ruling on this decision, on this position, and looked at all the facts in front of it. And the problem was, as I said, is that, you know, I worked on this case. I know the specifics of it. So, you know, and it's one that I followed very, very closely because it has quite profound significance. Britain was able to defend its security interests on this. But look, I mean, maybe one for another discussion, because I think we should be focusing more on Hungary. But I think this is all part and parcel of the problem that, you know, the world we're living in at the moment, where, as I say, you know, remembering, of course, that it was populists in the UK who were leading the charge against the Chagos Islands deal. And it was the Conservatives that originally essentially did the deal that Labour then picked up and ran with to get it over the line, and now is being criticised. But it was the Conservatives, you know, it was James Cleverly, if I remember rightly, as Foreign Secretary, who essentially had done the most of the work on the deal. As a Conservative, he recognised the profound damage that had been done to Britain's reputation. and that we could not look other countries in the eye and say, you need to follow international law, when we had this case ruling hanging over us. And so, as I say, the fact that now, we see populists going against this, Trump's gone against this, I think it's just part and parcel of a really dangerous world that we're entering into. And you say, oh, well, but, Britain didn't respect international law. Well, this was a really good example of where it was trying to show that it was.
James, look, I'm going to draw a line under this tangent. I think what I would propose is that you and I have a good debate about it. I think it's very interesting. I know you know a lot more about it than I do. Obviously, I concede that and acknowledge that framing. I'm not a lawyer, but I guess what I would say is I'm coming at this from a slightly normative perspective. When you see reports in the Financial Times or in the Guardian or whatever publication stating that Britain now has to acknowledge that it's no longer a global power, I don't like reading that. Maybe I'm a bit of a nationalist, I don't know, or just a patriot. But relinquishing the Chagos Islands is a significant strategic realization for the United Kingdom. And maybe to you, it doesn't matter because the UK has other means by which it can exercise its international, credibility, and maybe by adhering to international law that would strengthen it. Deepening relations with the EU instead of Brexit would be another way. My point is simply that when you have something like China and the islands that they have, the Spratly Islands and all that stuff that they've been creating in the South China Sea, and when the ICJ or whoever it was that distinguished in 2016 that those islands are illegal, they are plots of land, they're not national and sovereign territory. Why is it within the UK's best interests to adhere to international law when one of the biggest powers and adversaries in the United Kingdom, which is building the super embassy in the UK now, and I think that's a huge bad decision by the British government to accept that, by the way, is this the wisest thing? Is it the right thing to do? Maybe not. But is it practically the best thing to do for our interests, given the reality that we seem to be going to? China.
Well, I would say yes, because we retain the base. We would just have to pay for it. So the deal that was done with the Mauritians was effectively, this would be a way of saying to the Mauritians, look, we violated international law, but can we do a deal with you so that we can continue to use it? The Mauritians were more than happy to take, I believe it was $100 million a year for the next 100 years over this. So, and remembering, of course, Britain bought these islands. In fact, the problem was that when Britain separated it off, it gave Mauritius, and this is the moment I always say to people, it's an Austin Powers moment. For anyone who remembers the Austin Powers film, the princely sum of £3 million for this space, these territories, back in the early 1960s. Like 3 million. It was. Yeah, exactly. So Britain would retain these. And so it all would have been good and sorted. And the deal has been ripped up because Trump just, for whatever was going through Trump's mind or what he was told. But anyway, I think it's done damage. But I think that the point that we're getting to in all of this is that and maybe this is the good news story that we are hopefully seeing, is that, maybe, and I saw an interesting report on this earlier, that just saying that maybe the worst form of this populism can be defeated under the right circumstances. In Hungary's case, it's fascinating that the corruption, but, and I think people don't also realize just how unpleasant the Orban regime was in Hungary. And this is not something just in the past couple of years. I'm always reminded of a project that I was involved with a few years ago. And it was something fairly innocuous. I won't say what the project was on because it would give away, who the Hungarian was involved with it. But I remember talking with this Hungarian about their contribution on Hungary's role in this particular subject. And this person saying to me, I cannot write what is really going on. It is too dangerous to be able to say, exactly what's going on. And a number of academics I know, Hungarians, told me very, very clear examples that they had self-censored. They could not write what was, the real truth about what was going on in Hungary because their jobs, they just said, look, I've got a family to feed, I can't. And in many ways, it reminds me very much of what's gone on in Erdogan's Turkey, a very, very similar story of where people have had to self-censor. And it was shocking that this was taking place in an EU member state. And I think in many ways it was deeply, deeply depressing that the EU wasn't able to do more about this sooner as well, that it allowed this to continue far, far too long. And Orban was protected, let's remember, for a very, very long time by the European People's Party, the EPP, the main political party in the European Parliament, which brings together centre-right and right-wing political parties across Europe. They defended Orban for an exceptionally long time. And part of the reason he was able to do what he did in Hungary was because, there wasn't a stronger stance taken by Europe. It's also, I'm on a bit of a thing at the moment. The other thing that I think also we need to be asking ourselves about when it comes to Europe and dealing with these sorts of regimes in future, I don't know if you saw, but there was a recent report about the Hungarian foreign minister, Szijjártó, under Orban, who'd been passing information to the Russians. And I think that this raises a very, very serious question about how Europe will respond in future. That if you have senior political figures in an EU member state, and look, we could be saying the same about China, we could even be saying the same about the United States, that, in other countries, if that was happening, that would have been, somebody would have been up on charges of spying. But in Europe, they can't do anything. They could not. He would sit in those meetings, he would hear things, and then he was passing it on to Lavrov. So it was,
it's a revelation. Look, just on what we are back and forth from before, I think my framing is this is what I prefer, which is obviously it'd be great to adhere to international law, but the other part of me, the pragmatist, just worries about whether it's the best decision going, because no one else is adhering to it, and then therefore is it really the best thing to adhere to it because our reputation is better? Yes, but if it means that we're more at risk, I just worry about that. That's my main point, but I'll underline that.
But no, Pyotr, I just on that, if I could just say, I mean, I think I can see an argument in that way that the world is going in that, but you could also equally argue that that's a very narrow view that's based on a world that is just Russia, United States, Europe, and China. When I think what we're seeing is a lot of but I think there is a very good argument, and I've said it before, that there are a lot of other countries, Canada, large parts of Africa, and South America, which would like a very different approach to politics. And Europe and Britain, by showing that it adheres to international law, says that there are still those countries out there, and united, working together, those middle powers can actually seize back the initiative, from the United States, which I think is going down the drain, frankly, at the moment.
War in Iran
has been an absolute disaster for it. It's just as Ukraine has been a disaster for Putin. China emerges as a very different actor, but I think we need to have a slightly different conversation about, what China does. But essentially, I don't think it's such a wasted effort. I think it is if you just cast the world as United States, Russia, China, and Europe has got
the biggest political and nuclear powers in the entire world, James. That's a bit of just those sort of actors.
Yeah, but so I don't buy the argument that nuclear, just because you tag the label something as a nuclear power, that it gives it power, because I think Russia has proven time and time again it has nuclear weapons. That means you don't invade it, but that doesn't become a tool of outreach. I mean, how many of Russia's ambitions?
China considers it enough that it is proliferating its nuclear stockpile to at least 10 times what it has currently, based on satellite imagery and what the Chinese Communist Party are doing, James. So look, I want to bring us back to Hungary.
Patronising tone, that James, sort of, but I just
because I find it frustrating because you're not
nuclear power. No, because you've got to nuclear power. If you argue nuclear weapons give a country power, it's only on the basis that they're willing to use it. And are we in a world where any country is willing to use it? So what it
that's a
means
risk
is
that we
that you
want to
cannot
take.
be invaded. Nobody in their right mind is going to invade Russia. But that doesn't mean that that nuclear capability has given Russia an ability to project its power, which is ultimately what power is about. So
No, I disagree with you there. And
think
also,
that,
I think we should bring Michael back in at this point, because you and I are going to go back and forth, and otherwise we're not going to go anywhere.
You know, I love how I
disagree with you on this, and it's quite interesting to find where I fundamentally disagree with you for once, which is rare.
Well, you know, I love how the group is euphemistically called two liberals and a Marxist, and usually the Marxist sits back while watching the two liberals go at it. You know, that's where our strength lies, I guess. Ultimately, I will say once again, as I've said before, James and I are approaching this from two different avenues, but we are converging upon the same, conclusion. If we want to bring this back to Hungary, if we want to bring this back to Central Europe, in that regard. And, you know, in a way, I want to bring up a term that was, I don't know if Florian Bieber had created this term, but he has certainly coined it, stabilitocracy. James, I'm sure you're familiar with the term stabilitocracy. It's a type of government like Orban's Hungary, Vucic's Serbia, Gruevski's Macedonia, Erdogan's Turkey, in which the primary goal is stability, order, and security. And if the government can provide that, so much the better. What I find in a country like Hungary, which again, I am saying I am approaching this election with guarded optimism, because I would not be surprised if nothing really changes, is the idea that Orban's defeat largely came from one of two reasons. The primary reason is solely and exclusively because Fidesz has been in control of the country for 16 years. Any functioning democracy, liberal or illiberal, is eventually going to say, we've had enough of the status quo. We are going to vote for a credible, organized opposition, if nothing else, to provide us with some kind of alternative option. The second one, and I honestly don't know how much this really played into it, but yes, you're absolutely right. MAGA played very much into endorsing Orban. If it wasn't Trump, it was definitely Vance. Vance has this nasty tendency of going to countries, putting his 2 cents into something, and then whatever it is that he supports ends up being absolutely chosen against. So, in that regard, it was really a matter of time. Personally, as far as I'm concerned, if there was a organized opposition against Orban and Fidesz, it didn't matter whether, Vance or Hegseth or Trump or MAGA or whoever got themselves involved. Hungary is, at the end of the day, a democratically consolidated state. It may not be the most transparent. It may very much be a type of clientelistic democracy. This is very much indicative of how the state emerged in the early 1990s. We have to remember something here, that there was no equivalent to the type of social civic protest in Hungary that we saw in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, or in Germany. The Hungarian communists had got the message 1 year earlier to start reforming. And so, in my opinion, when Hungary transitioned from single-party communism, single-party authoritarianism, to political pluralism, the communists simply decided to stop being communists. It was a country that was largely an internal reform, which explains much of Orban and Fidesz's criticism of the MZSP for much of the 1990s. This makes Central Europe far more unique. We tend to think that Central Europe was like the poster children for countries that got rid of single-party bureaucratic authoritarian rule and embraced this type of EU political pluralism. It doesn't happen. When you look at Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, I'm not even talking about the Baltics, we end up seeing a type of proto-national populism that is already embedded within the political process that defines much of the political rhetoric. So, James is absolutely correct in talking about how Orban effectively engaged in state capture, which is the reason why I regarded Hungary as a stabilitocratic regime. In the last 16 years, Fidesz was able to change much of the constitutional framework of the country because they had a supermajority in parliament. If Magyar's TISA party comes in, the only way that I am going to see any real reform is if they have enough representatives in the Hungarian parliament to overrule many of these changes that were made by Fidesz. If, on the other hand, TISA is basically to Orban what Blair was to Thatcher, what Clinton was to Bush, what third-way Democrats are to right-wing neolibs, we are simply going to witness more of the same, but just under different leadership. That's the sobering reality of Central European politics since 1990.
So just some breaking news here.
What's going to happen now with Ukraine then? Because I think that's where all eyes are going to be on.
So as far as Ukraine is concerned, the election of TISA removes an annoying obstacle to EU initiatives to continue funding Ukraine. It is going to put all the more pressure on people like Fico to, either fall into line or risk losing his, political monopoly. But here is where I once again say I could be wrong, but we need to really keep an eye on this, is that sentiment among ordinary voters in Slovakia, in Hungary, in the Czech, even in Poland, are not ready to just simply march lock, stock, and barrel with all for Ukraine and screw Russia. These are countries that engage in small state syndrome. You talked before, James, about Trianon. Hungary went from the trauma of Trianon to the trauma of small state syndrome. They are a small country in the middle of Europe. They have a unique language, a unique history, and as far as they're concerned, Hungary is the only country that represents the Hungarian nation. They are going to make a number of pragmatic conclusions within the EU that is going to first and foremost benefit Hungary. So I don't see any major change between Magyar and Orban in this point. Orban, every so often brought up this idea that maybe we should have a referendum on leaving the EU. That's suicide for a small country like Hungary. You know it as well as I do. They are not going to leave. They benefit from the EU, from the common economic market. What they hate about the EU is this whole sense of multiculturalism and harboring safe havens for immigrants. This Central European sentiment is very much ethnocentric. It's in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in the Baltics, and in Hungary. They can be pro-democratic, pro-Western, pro-EU, but absolutely ethnocentric exclusionist.
Sounds very pragmatic, though, Michael.
It's realism for these small countries, but we tend to, that's why I'm saying we have to decouple this idea that just because somebody that is more pro-Western than Orban is suddenly going to make everything better in Hungary. It is not, because even when Igor Matovic's Oľano party won, hands down, a parliamentary election in Slovakia against Fico's Smer, he had to form a coalition with a number of unbelievable traditional conservatives to create a government. Matovic is now out, Fico is back in, and the kingmaker in Slovakia is a defector from Smer, Petar Pellegrini, who runs this new party called Hlas, who is more than willing to work with Fico. I'm just simply, I could be wrong, but be very, very, very cautious about what we will see in the immediate future for Hungary. I would not put it past TISA at one point to start coalitioning with Fidesz.
So Michael, he said, Peter Magyar said almost 24 hours ago that, quote, Hungary will be again a strong ally in the European Union and NATO. However, we also need to look at some of his first policy statements, which are Hungary will not stop buying Russian oil. We're sort of covering what we touched upon earlier, but in greater depth. It will seek, quote, the safest and cheapest oil, regardless of origin, which will likely be the United States or Russia at this point. And he hopes that the EU will lift Russian sanctions once the war in Ukraine ends, albeit he never put an end date on it. So that shows quite a big like contradiction there, doesn't it? Or contrast that.
No, it doesn't.
For me, a major ally, but he also wants to sort of be dependent on Russia for energy.
Yes. Welcome to Central Europe. Welcome to Visegrad 4. This is how Central Europe operates. This is how they have always operated. And people get surprised by this. It's just because they haven't been paying enough attention, which is why I'm saying is that, Magyar's election over Orban has less to do with pro-Russia, pro-EU than just simply the idea, and James is right on the, Orban has run the country like an organized crime syndicate for the last 15 years. People are tired. That's it. They're not going to, again, I could be wrong. Yeah, I'll tell you what, if I'm wrong, have me on, and you can have me here for an hour going mea culpa. But I'm fairly certain that Magyar is not going to change much. The only difference is that, rhetorically speaking, Magyar is smart enough to understand Hungary cannot survive outside of the Eurozone. They cannot.
So what should we, to both of you then, he's saying the right things, it seems to be, to keep everyone happy right now. But where's his actual policy going to lie? Is it going to be more leaning Russian woods or leaning EU and Brussels woods?
Well, let me get my point in. Let me get my point in before James does, because I think James is going to have a more educated approach on it than I am. But my approach to all of this is that Magyar is very much a mass elite. And if he realizes that it is more prudent for him to toe the EU line than Russia, he's going to. But remember, Magyar joined TISA only a year to 2 years ago. He has not been a founding member of this party, which is why a part of me that is being skeptical is saying, if TISA is nothing more than just simply a catch-all anti-Fidesz, anti-corruption party, it's not going to last. What Central Europe has shown us since the early 90s is that established political parties exist in the long run. You might have a couple of flash in the pans that are able to win electorally against popular and sentimental resentment of corruption. But those parties, whether it is Smer in Slovakia or PiS in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary, they have resilience, they have supporters, and they may very well come back. I could be wrong. I'm not saying this is a one-to-one comparison with Slovakia, but I'm just simply saying, look at Slovakia from in the last couple of years before Fico comes back, and you'll realize that this is little more than a temporary blip.
I'm just I just looked up how old Orban is. He's 62.
62, yeah. He's still got time.
He's not old.
You could see him coming back. I don't think he's necessarily out of the picture.
That's the worry. I mean, you can, and I think that's the point that Michael's making, that, there is a tradition of this, and it's not. And Orban's already said he's not going to step aside. And I suspect he can't afford to step aside simply because, I'm not sure what the precise things of, within the Hungarian parliamentary system of whether he has immunity as long as he remains an MP. But yeah, because otherwise, as I say, the real test in many ways is whether Magyar will, I wasn't about to say order an investigation and trial, but will permit an investigation and trial. I think it's
possible. I don't know if it's going to work, but I wouldn't put it past him. I would not put it past him to do this. No, but this is not going to be an anti-corruption thing. This is going to be an anti-Fidesz and anti-Orban thing. They're not going to get rid of they are not going to get rid of the pattern of patronage and corruption. That's the big thing. That's why I'm saying it was not a surprise that Orban lost. The man has been running the country for 16 years. This is simply electoral fatigue. And I'm not putting anything else beyond that.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know what to say.
Picture, but I think, as again, we've said it before that well, Michael, you and I have seen it many times of sort of politicians who start off with the best of intentions, and then it goes wrong. But Pyotr, I see the point. It's not going to happen tomorrow. You know, I think there is a honeymoon period, and I think this is going to be absolutely fascinating to see how Europe woos him. And I think Magyar's probably savvy enough to appreciate that. So the question is whether he's just a younger, prettier Orban in the making, remembering, of course, that Orban started off as a sort of liberal, fairly svelte, actually.
He did.
And
he was
gradually was corrupted. Or whether he's more like a Maloney figure who actually is socialized by Europe and actually sort of then actually starts to become a very pro-European figure. All right, retaining certain elements of populist politics, there's no doubt about it, but certainly working with European partners to the point that isn't seen as a troublemaker and is actually sort of seen as a very important figure in many ways, as a counterbalance to the far right sort of pro-Russian voices of being able to present, well, here is somebody who comes from a fairly far right position, but also is in favor of European integration and cooperation.
And may I add that this is very much indicative of the definition of stabilitocracy that Florian Bieber coined, is that the EU is more than happy to work with somebody like like Magyar or Vučić or Gruevski or Kurti or whoever, as long as they toe a hardline line. They can be absolutely despotic at home, but they can be very much cooperative in the international sense. And so in that regard, I would not be surprised if the EU turns blind eye and deaf ear to continued national populism in Hungary, provided that Magyar is more pro-EU, more pro-Ukraine than he is pro-Russian. And they'll be more than happy to make that Faustian bargain.
The other interesting element in all of this, of course, is you sort of mentioned about Vučić, and I wonder how Vučić must be feeling about all of this, because he has built up a very close relationship with Orban, which has not gone unnoticed. And a lot in Europe have been very unhappy about it. But again, rather in the same way that Vance went to Budapest and was campaigning for Orban, whether Magyar will be looking at southern neighbor and thinking, I'm not going to do any favors for Vučić. He was so in favor of Orban. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Belgrade.
That's a good question. That is a very good question. I have to say, I wouldn't be surprised if Magyar continues the same pro-Serbian politics, because Serbia and Hungary, I mean, what are the main lines of contention? As long as the Serbs allow the Hungarian minority in Vojvodina to provide some active role in a government coalition, so much the better. If I were Vučić, and I don't want to move this into a conversation about what it is to do with Vučić. But what I will say, I'll be very quick about this, is that as long as there is no credible organized opposition in Serbia against the Serbian Progressive Party and against Vučić, he is safe. But for the time being, that is the case. But James, you and I know as well as what we know about Hungary, Vučić is not popular in Serbia. There are many, many, many people who would be more than happy to see him gone. But the realization is that in electoral politics, unless there is somebody on the ballot that you can credibly vote for, there we go.
So, firstly, age is not a determinant of experience. I may be a newbie, but it doesn't mean I don't have experience. Some of you commenting on that. Second, clearly the loss of Hungary is going to be a setback, I think, for some of the more Russian-leaning entities within Europe. But it's also not the only determinant. And if you step back and look at this from an overall perspective, the European Union has been wanting to make adjustments to the way that it makes decisions. The unanimity decision-making element of the bloc is wanting to be diluted for more of a majority. We've seen Macron reference this in regard to the economic, I can't remember the last resort. I can't remember the exact thing he mentioned about a month ago, but right, that they can use the last resort against the United States in a tariff war kind of thing. So there's quite a clear appetite, I think, amongst Brussels to really try to dilute the need for unanimous voting so that you can actually get policy through, to get bills through. And ultimately, I think this kind of might sum up the new Hungarian government's approach, which is they're not going to support the bill for Ukraine, but they're not going to veto it either. So it's sort of inertia in action, I suppose. They're sort of passively just, taking a neutral. It's like abstaining in a UN vote, effectively. I think that might summarize the initial choices and actions by the government. I remain cautiously optimistic. Maybe that's my age and naivety, but I do think that there's enough difference here regarding Ukraine and some of the bigger systemic issues facing the continent at the moment that makes him enough different to Orban. What I do think is more important is if we see a concerted and quite evident effort to reverse some of the Urbanization, if that's the right word to use, of the Hungarian political mechanisms and bodies, etc., then that's a positive sign. It's the same with the United States. If Gavin Newsom won in 2028 or whatever, and we see him remove, because Trump imposed a lot of figures who are loyal to him in the civil service as a way to try and politicize as much as he can within the United States system as it exists. So if we see a reverse of that vis-a-vis Hungary and anything, then that's a positive sign. If we don't, and there's a continuation in largely the same way that Orban has been, then yeah, maybe it's just the same cat with different spots, or whatever the expression is, right? It doesn't really change. So I'm hoping for the best, but not also getting too carried away with this. And ultimately, I think also for NATO, I think it's very important. We haven't touched on it as much as I thought we might, but I think that's an important element here. Hungary might not be a military superpower or major player, but of course, like any entity within the alliance, it has an important role to play in the consultations, in the decision making of the group, presenting a unified front. And if we're going to imagine a NATO without the United States, theoretically a NATO minus, but imagine Ukraine comes in, that's actually a lot more of a mobile and flexible body, because NATO is suddenly much more concentrated on its near abroad, the Arctic, Russia, migration to the south and Africa. And it actually could make it more nimble without the US, because it's not being dragged into Middle Eastern issues or China. Not that it maybe shouldn't, but Hungary would of course be important for that because of Visegrad and the countries that, if Trump wants to reallocate resources from Spain, Germany, you move the base from Germany into further Eastern Europe. That's a big deal, because it actually bolsters the eastern flank and the Eastern Sentinel, as Mark Rutte has said. And some of the comments from Mark Rutte over Hungary's election was quite evident. Clearly, he sees Hungary as a critical component, because it means that streamline and effective decision making. But anyway, gentlemen, I don't know if you guys have anything else you want to, what takeaways would we say? What should we watch out for? Not just in the case of Hungary, but in anything European. Otherwise, we will be back hopefully in a couple of weeks, I guess.
I don't know. I think. Well, for my part, I'd said, yeah, I want to be optimistic about it, but I think it's sort of, and maybe it is too early to be thinking. Maybe it's just most thing I tend to be upbeat about it. I think many years working on Balkan politics has taught me that these sort of leaders who come in who are sort of breakoffs of other parties, they say and do the right things for a few years, and then, but look, as I say, it's just the day after. It's probably not worth thinking too negatively at the moment. I think obviously the good thing is that Orban is out. He really was a nasty piece of work in every possible way. And one thing I also have to say is that what I always found tedious was the number of MAGA who seem to hold Orban up as this great hero and say, he defends national interests, that's why you don't like him. My immediate response was, all right, if he defends national interests and he hates the European Union so much, why doesn't he pull Hungary out of the European Union if it's that contrary to Hungarian interests? And as you say, the EU is evil and liberal and all these sort of things. He could have, at any moment, he could have taken the Brexit path. He was a coward, ultimately. He'd like to rant and rave. caused all sorts of trouble, but ultimately he knew that he relied on the EU for the patronage that kept him in power, for the disbursement of funds, and he played Europe very, very well for a very long time to get as much money out of other European partners. You know, the number of times they had to bribe him, and then that money would then be taken either to go into the pockets of him and his cronies, or else would go to buying votes. He was not the hero that a lot of people seem to think he was.
Michael, any last thoughts?
Well, I mean, like I said, I've always said, look at Central European politics, because that's kind of like the wave of the future. It is predicated on illiberal democracy, national populism. I agree with James in the sense that I really have a wonder why certain elements of the MAGA population looked at Hungary as some kind of role model, because you really cannot compare the United States with Hungary. Hungary is a small country in the middle of Europe that has been, for better or for worse, reeling from the trauma of Trianon for the last century, and trying to find a balance between being a small state in a larger organization. And yeah, absolutely, to James's point, is that Orban can play the Eurosceptic card, but he is never going to call for a referendum on an EU exit. They can't afford it. It's not feasible at all. If anything, the type of national populism that defines much of the Visegrad Four is they wish that the EU was exactly what they portray themselves as, an economic regulatory body, not a political body. That's what they ultimately want. They joined the EU in 2004 because it was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. They will rant and rail against, all kinds of multiculturalism, refugee settlements, collective foreign policy against Russia, China, Iran. They have to go along with whatever Brussels says. What Orban, I think, to his credit, was praised for is being a small voice in a larger body, effectively saying that a country like Hungary should have more of an independent, autonomous foreign policy in deciding what is right for Hungary, which plays very nicely into the politics of Fico in Slovakia, Vučić in Serbia, Babiš in the Czech Republic. But these, at the end of the day, are small countries. They're small potatoes. If Serbia ever joins the European Union, they are going to effectively be told, sort of the same things. As I said, I am guardedly optimistic about a change in Hungary. But if Central Europe tells me anything, it is that a change in party government simply does that. It is just simply a change in party government and government control. It does not change the ideology and the scope of that country. And that is something that we can and should talk about, the sort of the paradox of Central European transition from single-party authoritarian rule in 1988-89 to where they are today. They're integrated in the EU. They are in NATO. They are considered consolidated democracies. I am not surprised one bit that Orban acknowledged his defeat and gave deference to Magyar. But please do not think that this is a major changeover. Central European democracy is predicated very much so on homo-ethnogeneous demography, nationalism within Europe. They will play the anti-Russian card simply because they want to out-European the Europeanists. Let's say, let's see where Magyar goes. He could be another Orban. I could be wrong.
From my side, I think Hungary is a country that is facing an incredibly challenging future demographically. I don't think
that's another major issue. Absolutely correct.
The element of demography. Back in 1994, Hungary was considered a country which had the term was first used called lowest low. And that's because the TFR, or total fertility rate, was just above 1, right? 1 child per mother, which is meant to be 2.1 if you want a replacement population. So Hungary is in a challenging position from an economic, political, social area. And I think that is felt by a lot of Hungarians, but I will simply leave with two anecdotes. One, that Americans and Hungarians alike thought it rather weird that an American vice president flew all the way to interfere in a country's election, yet constantly preach about non-foreign interference. And second, a comment on my video that I posted late last night, simply stating, what have I missed? I've downed a bottle of vodka for the first time in 20 years. I'm glad Orban is gone, and let's see what happens next. And I think that's a good point to end on. But certainly, everyone for watching, thank you very much. Michael, James, as always, it's a pleasure. Do follow these guys, everyone, if you don't know who they are. They come at things from a different perspective, but clearly to the same point, to Michael's emphasis. And I have to jump off now for another stream in about 20 minutes to discuss the naval blockade in Strait of Hormuz.
The blockade of the blockade.
Yes, precisely. But we'll see you all soon, very, very much, everyone. And thanks always for your time, and speak soon.